Hi, my name is Stacey Jimenez. I'll be talking about Scotland's history with England, just an overview of everything that's happened thus far. So, starting off with Elizabeth I of England, she died in 1603 and she was childless. Her successor was James VI, or also known as James I. So his full name was James Charles Stuart. And again, he was the predecessor to Elizabeth I of England, and he was James VI, King of Scotland, from 1567 to 1603. He then moved his court to England and became James I, King of England and Ireland, from 1603 until his death in 1605. Now, his father was Henry Lord Darnley, and his mother was Mary, Queen of Scots, and his great great grandfather was Henry VII of England. So, the gunpowder plot was an assassination attempt to blow up King James I and Parliament on November 5th of 1605, and this was organized by Robert Catesby. Um, a conspirator with Catesby got a guy named Guy Fawkes followed through with this plan, or at least tried to follow through with the plan, but was caught and executed for treason. So Charles I of England became king when his father, again James VI, moved his court to England. He's the second son of James VI. So he became king of England and Ireland starting at 1605, but he did have problems with his parliament during his rule and was executed in 1649 for treason. So Charles II of England was recognized by his father's dominions as king in 1650 after his father's execution. The Scots wanted to help him press his claim to become the actual king of England. So a man named Oliver Cromwell wanted to prevent that. So that leads to the Battle of Dunbar. So Oliver Cromwell decided that he wanted to go to battle with Charles II, excuse me. So this would have been between the Scottish army and the army of the English Republic. Unfortunately, while the Scots seemed to be more prepared than the English still won the battle, since the Scots didn't have enough rations to wait on the English. So when Cromwell found some weaknesses in the Scottish troop deployment, he used those weaknesses against the Scots to launch his attack, and then again defeating the Scottish army with his new model army vets. And he did this by using his vets by separating his vets in different groups to make them seem like there was more of them than there actually was. Um, and yeah, so the Scots didn't actually know that he had this new army that he collected while heading over to the Battle of Dunbar. And they were taken by surprise, and they were defeated. So the Acts of Union, so Scotland was clinging to their own parliament while sharing a monarch with England. They had many bad harvests and actually failed to attempt to establish a colony in Panama. They realized after this that they needed help from England, so the Act of Union was passed in 1707, which made the United Kingdom of Britain. So it was Scotland and England put together. Okay, so some of the Scots were unconvinced of the benefits of the Union. So there was a group, a rebellion called the Jacobites, um, that was started by Charles Edward Stuart to regain the British throne for his father, James Francis Edward Stuart, the second son of Charles I, excuse me. So a minority of the Scots supported Charles, another minority of the Scots were against him. However, there was a majority that didn't really care about overthrowing the monarchy that was already put in place at the time. So the English was not prepared for this rebellion of the Jacobites, and Charles Edward Stuart gained control of Scotland, but not of England. He did want to try to extend this victory to England, but there was word that reached to Derby, which is a city in England, that the Jacobites were coming to try again to gain England for Charles Edward Stuart. But there was a militia called the Derbyshire Blues, which is a militia regiment raised in Derby by the Duke of Devonshire, in response to the invasion by Charles Edward Stuart in 1745. And they heard that the Jacobites were coming to Derby, so they retreated a couple miles back to try to catch them off guard. They ended up being able to catch them off guard, and they actually defeated the Jacobites. So all after that, all those who supported Charles stopped supporting him, and Charles Edward Stuart turned to alcoholism, and Scotland was never challenged by British rule again. Okay. So, with the defeat of the Jacobites come the rise of challenging and dangerous ideas from people like Adam Smith, David Hume, and James Hutton. So these people made Scotland see their importance, which made them rise up from the subordinate position within the UK. So, with this, political struggle was kind of done, but social struggle was still at a high. There was a couple people actually, named Andrew Hardy and John Bird and Andrew Wilson that led rebellions against the social struggle in Scotland. So they were stopped by local forces loyal to the government, and later on were executed for starting these rebellions. So again, following the failed Jacobite Rising of 1745, the post of Scottish Secretary in the British government had been abolished. Um, but in 1885, the post was recreated and led to the creation of the Scottish Office to administer central government functions in Scotland. So at that point, Scotland had its own identity and was recognized by the state, but was still part of the United Kingdom. So, skipping over to around 1922, after World War II, some Scots believed that Scotland needed to rediscover itself. So, one of those Scots was a man named Christopher Murray. He was a Christopher Murray Grieve. He was a journalist and poet at the time, but he argued under the name of Hugh MacDiarmid that there needed to be a cultural revival to establish Scotland as a political entity. So he set up a magazine, a literature magazine named the Scottish Chapbook, and his motto was being not tradition, presidents. He was credited for establishing an interest in Scottish literature, and MacDiarmid became a founding member of the National Party of Scotland. So in the 1970s, MacDiarmid brought about the Scottish nationalism, but it was not a political force, or at least the generation after him didn't see it as that. So a Scottish nationalist named Winnie Ewing won a by-election for the Scottish National Party. And Britain's mainstream political parties believed in devolving the powers to Scotland. So the Labour government wanted voters to vote on the devolution. But in 1979, the legislation found, after the voting of the devolution, that at least 40% of the electorate voted yes to the devolution. However, months later, Margaret Thatcher, who was a British stateswoman, was in power in Westminster, and she did not want to devolve the power to Scotland. In 1997, Labour returned under a man named Tony Blair, and it and the Labour government had a new plan of a Scot had a new plan for a Scottish Parliament and a referendum. There was a two-question vote. The Scottish electorate gave the answer that there would be a Scottish Parliament and it would have tax-rising powers. Fast forward 2 years later, Scotland had its own voice within the United Kingdom. And lastly, in 2011, there was an election, a Scottish election, and the Labour government and the Liberal Democrats formed a coalition. So the Scottish National Party wanted to give the voters a referendum on the independence, but most of the Scottish Parliament didn't want that plan approved. However, that was changed in the Scottish election of 2011 when voting to elect members of the Scottish Parliament. The Scottish National Party won by an overall majority, and there was, in fact, a referendum at the end. Thank you very much. And that's it.